welcome to True Crime and Wine. I am Sherrilyn Dale, and I'm so glad you found me. This outfit, until I looked in the camera, I wasn't really sure what it was, and now I'm like, it's giving Scary Spice meets Beetlejuice with gray hair. We're just gonna let those girls have their moment today. All right? Okay, perfect. Today's case, it was suggested to me recently. I have poured through my comments. I cannot for the life of me find who suggested it. I am so sorry that I can't give you a proper shout out and thank you. If it was you, thank you so much. Let me know in the comments so I can give you a little love. Thank you so much to HelloFresh for sponsoring today's video. I already always love HelloFresh, but I have been so thankful for them this week in particular. We had a lot of rain last week and the week before. We needed it, so I'm not complaining. But now this week, it's been so nice and warm. And the last thing on my mind on a good day is thinking about dinner. But when it's really nice and warm, like, I have things to do, baby. I've got memories to make. I got activities on the list up the wazoo, and cooking's not one of them. So when the box showed up this Monday, I was like kind of like a little child inside, because I was like, oh my God, right now I'm making the girls a backyard, like Barbie theme backyard area, and that's all my focus is right now. So it's not cooking, it's not figuring out what it is. So HelloFresh like just took all the guesswork out for me this week. Haley helped me cook this week, and we chose the chicken souvlaki dinner plate. It was so delicious. Even my niece is over right now, and she's a very, very particular eater. I don't want to say like picky and give her like a bad rep. She's particular. The girl knows what she likes, and that's usually just like plain pasta or like cheese pizza. So we made this kind of like on our toes, and she ate it all and then asked me like, Auntie, who made that? I was like, I did it. And I told her that I made it from scratch, and she was really impressed. So if you want to impress like a 6-year-old, you can tell them that you came up with it all on your own. I also love that HelloFresh now has like those snack options to add on. We spend so much of our time at the lake if we can, and there's always people that are coming in and out. So the top of my list this week coming up is the s'mores bundle for the kids to do up, and their snack board that has pretzel bites, spiced bar nuts, and hot honey peach jam. Literally, like, I'm salivating just thinking about it. So yeah, if you guys have not tried HelloFresh, and you can't feel my energy and excitement every single time I talk about them, you have to. Summer is the best time to do that. We have so much to do, like I said. Like, don't even thinking about dinner. There's other things to plan. Let the experts do it for you, okay? Head on over to HelloFresh.com and use my code Sherrilyn16 for 16 free meals plus free shipping. Yep, that is HelloFresh.com, and use my code at the checkout, Sherrilyn16 for 16 free meals plus free shipping. Thank you again so much, HelloFresh, for sponsoring today's video, and thank you guys that are watching for supporting those who support me, sponsors like HelloFresh. Riddle time. Today's riddle is, what kind of room has no windows or doors? I am so excited for you guys to like hear what this answer is. Okay, I'm gonna give you a hint. It's like adorable, okay? It's adorable. All right, yeah, okay, let's get started. Huge thank you to Adam Carter for the piece that he did on CBC on this called Wayward Son, and Anne Brocklehurst for her book Dark Ambition that I also got a lot of information from. Today's case is a Canadian case, and this is one for the books. Like, I don't know if I've ever come across one like this. Just like the senselessness and the boldness and the absolutely unnecessariness, not a word, right? Anyways, it's just like, I don't have a word for what happened, why it happened, it shouldn't have happened, and it's a series of deaths that shouldn't have happened. When you think you want to put like a face to pure evil or a story to absolute pure evil, this is it. Today we are going to start with the last day of a gentleman named Tim Bosma's life. He was a 32-year-old father and husband. He was from Ancaster, which is, I believe, a community within the city of Hamilton. And he went for a test drive with potential buyers of a truck that he was selling, and he never returned. It was the evening of May 6, 2013, and for weeks, Tim had been trying to sell his 2007 Dodge 3500. Tim and his wife, Sherrilyn, are described as a very kind, church-going family. They're first-time parents to a 2-year-old little girl. They met online November 2008 and married February 13, 2010. They had their daughter less than a year after they had gotten married, and then their plan was to have another 3 children and then adopt another child. So 3 of their own and then adopt another child into the family. The night that Tim went for this test drive, just that specific short period of time that they were going through in life, things were tight financially, and a bunch of issues were happening with this truck specifically. It had needed a new transmission. Its tire rod had snapped. There were some other issues. So basically, it was just like this money pit that wouldn't quit. So Tim's wife posted a couple ads for the truck online, one on Kijiji and one on AutoTrader. And the ad said, 2007 Dodge Power Ram 3500 diesel 4x4 pickup truck, 170,000 kilometers, mostly highway, 5.9 liter engine, extended cab, short box, gray cloth interior, new transmission, new brakes, price $24,000. I believe this was the second time that the ad had ran. They also tried in April. And so the Bosmas got a call the day of May 6th from a man who had seen the truck on Kijiji and wanted to come by and see it. He arranged to come to the Bosma's house that evening around 8:30 p.m. That was odd in itself, like a kind of late at night. The Bosmas didn't live in a very busy central area. It was kind of off the beaten path to get to, but they wanted to sell it. So 8:30 came and went and nobody had shown up. Tim and Sherrilyn had tucked their daughter into bed and were starting to get a little bit frustrated that no one had come. Still hopeful though, and not sure what they should do, just kind of about like the sketchiness of the situation, it being so late. Tim looked at his wife and said, if he shows up, should I go with him? And Sherrilyn thought about it and said, yeah, you should, because we want the truck to come back. And in her mind, she said she was thinking like, if they were to steal this truck, neither of us have a way to get to work tomorrow. Tim was like, you're right, but who the heck comes this late to see a truck anyways? By 9 p.m., no one had shown up. So Sherrilyn was now in the garage bay of their home, and she was sharing a cigarette with their friend and tenant who rented out the basement. And at 9:20 from the garage, she could hear Tim's cell phone ring. She couldn't get like a clear read, or she couldn't hear the conversation quite clearly, but she could hear that Tim was talking. Just a quick conversation, and all of a sudden she sees like these 2 men coming up their driveway. They're on foot, which kind of caught her off guard because there was no sign of a vehicle that they arrived in. And like I said, they didn't live in the center of the city in a busy community with, like rows of houses. And from what they had told Tim, the Bosmas knew that they were coming from Toronto, which is actually one of the reasons why they were kind of hopeful and staying awake, because this was over an hour drive to get to them. So they were like, if they're going to spend that amount of time driving, it's pretty promising. Sherrilyn said that the vibe that she got from the guys, there were 2 different ones. One of the gentlemen was more talkative, a little bit more clean cut and outgoing. And then the other one was more shy, even sketchy by her words. He had a red hoodie and the hood was up, and he just kind of stood there with his hands in his pocket and didn't say much. So they're like, oh, like, did you walk here from Toronto? And their explanation was that their friend had dropped them off down the road and was just going to grab a coffee at a Tim Hortons close by. There's also some people who said that they had a friend that went to go get gas close by and then was going to bring everybody else a coffee. There's variations. All we know is Tim Hortons is pretty consistent, and that they said that there was somebody else. And all we know is that Tim came out of the house to greet them. They all did a scan around the Dodge. Tim chatted with them for a little bit, and then he went over to Sherrilyn and said, okay, we're just going to go on a quick test drive and I'll be right back. They got in the vehicle. It was the taller, more clean-cut fellow that was in the driver's seat. Tim was in the passenger seat, and then the quieter guy with the hoodie was in the back. They drove off, and Sherrilyn and her friend, they just kind of look at each other, and to break the tension, her friend was like, Sherrilyn said to her friend, well, that was a little bit weird. And her friend was feeling it too, and then just to, sometimes I'm like this, with dark humor, try to like smooth the situation over, isn't always the right decision. In this case, he cracked a joke like, well, that might be the last time we ever see Tim. And unfortunately, like, he was right. After they had left, Sherrilyn just had gone into the house. She popped on a show that she had on PVR that was one that Tim wouldn't watch with her, and kind of got caught up in it, and then realized it was 10:20, like this was an hour show, an hour had passed, and Tim wasn't home. She tried calling his cell phone a bunch of times. He didn't pick up, and it was really concerning because not only didn't he pick up, it wasn't ringing. And she specifically remembered that when he got home from work, he made sure that his cell phone was charged. And so now all of a sudden he goes on this late night, test drive, and his phone is now going to voicemail, and he's been gone for an hour. She went down to talk to their friend, and he said, okay, well, these guys said that their friend was going to meet them or was going to the Tim Hortons. So he decided to go and drive to the Tim Hortons and see if anybody knew these guys. No one did. And then he just took some back roads or roads that you would think maybe they would have taken this test drive on to see if he could see at least maybe Tim somewhere stranded or the truck like missing. No, there was nothing. When he got back, Sherrilyn's just a disaster, but she's not wanting to be that overreactive wife. Maybe she's running through all of these situations in her head. Maybe they just took it a little bit farther, wanted to really gun it and see what it could do. And then she started thinking, well, maybe it went really well, and they just stopped by at a local pub to sign out, all of the paperwork and have a beer and just, shake on it over a drink. So she drives to a local pub that Tim would sometimes go and have a quick beer at. And while she's driving there, she decides to call 911, and that's where police go and meet her. And when they arrive, Tim nor these two guys are at the pub. The case was taken pretty seriously from the get-go. This wasn't something like Tim and Sherrilyn had an argument and he went out for a drive and he was kind of taking his time to come back and cool off. This was he went with strangers who had come from an ad that they had seen for him selling his truck, and then now all of a sudden he is missing and so is the truck. That next morning, there was an entire ground search of the area. They had canine search and rescue. A bunch of people from the community also came out to help, and they called themselves Tim's Army. There was like hundreds of people looking for Tim. And then the police, they held a press briefing to talk about the case, saying that there was a missing man under unusual circumstances. They held this press briefing in two days in a row, on the 7th and on the 8th. And it was the second day that people really took it seriously. I think on the first day, when somebody's missing under unusual circumstances, people can just take that and run. And there was so much speculation. Oh, he was probably into a bad lifestyle. Oh, it was probably this related. It was probably that related. And there wasn't really this urgency that was needed from the public to take it seriously. And so the next day, Sherrilyn spoke, and it was really, really powerful because she was obviously emotional, but you could see that she was just so strong and brave and angry. She was able to bring Tim to life as this loving husband, loving father, this real person. He was the fun uncle also that his nieces and nephews needed back, the son that his parents needed to have, and her husband, like he needed to be reunited with his family. And then she just looks in the camera and she just speaks dead on to these two people that her husband left with and angrily says, it was just a truck. Just a truck. You don't need him. We do. Like, let him come home. Behind the scenes, there was a lot of detective work going on, and police quickly discovered that the phone call that was placed to Tim's phone that evening to say that they had arrived or were arriving shortly came from a burner phone. And using records from this burner phone, police discovered 2 other test drives that were set up by this phone with similar vehicles in the days before Tim disappeared. One of those test drives, it was set up, but they never arrived, so obviously that never occurred. But the other one, 2 men had gone on a test drive in a Dodge 3500 diesel truck, same as Tim's. This was in Toronto on May 5th, so the day before Tim disappeared. The man that took them on this test drive was a gentleman named Igor. And Igor's experience was very similar to what Sherrilyn was saying. The men were described similarly. One of them more outgoing, clean cut. The other one less talkative and more reserved. Igor also said one of them carried this small little satchel bag. And on his wrist, he had a tattoo of the word ambition that was like tattooed within a box. And this was something that he thought about it. Like it stood out to him even when other things didn't really stand out to him during the test drive. And so that was a detail that police released to the public hoping for identification. And it was huge. Because of that description, on May 10th, a Toronto man named Dylan Millard came onto their radar when they were looking into cross-referencing anybody who had been arrested or had an arrest record having that tattoo, and he did. In 2008, he had been arrested for possession of marijuana, and then in 2012, driving while disqualified. Now, on the outside, Dylan Millard is not somebody that you would peg for a criminal. I don't even know what that means these days. He was born on August 30th, 1985 to Wayne Millard and Madeline Burns. Madeline and Wayne had met through Air Canada when Wayne was a pilot and she was a stewardess. And Wayne also piloted his own family's planes. His father, Carl, had started his own charter airline in 1954. It was called Millard Air, and at its height, it had a fleet of 21 planes. Even though Millard Air had filed for bankruptcy in 1990, the family had continued to operate like an aircraft servicing maintenance company, and this was at Toronto Pearson's International Airport, and they did that for over 20 years. So Dylan grew up in Toronto, Ontario, the only child to very wealthy parents. And on the outside, he appeared to be on a really successful path in life. In 1999, when he was only 14 years old, he set a world record for being the youngest person to fly both a helicopter and a fixed-wing plane solo in one day.
Millard first made headlines at 14, the youngest ever to take solo flights on one day in both an airplane and helicopter.
It's like holding a plate on your finger, trying to keep that thing straight, and it was very much different, but I got used to it.
As he got older, it appeared that he was making good financial decisions to be smart with his money. He owned several properties in the Toronto area, one of them being a $1.2 million home. Today, I can't even imagine if it's a home, if it was 1.2 million, because like an apartment is going for that these days. He also owned a $500,000 condo, a $2 million residential rental, an $850,000 just 100-acre farm. And he had just finalized the purchase of another condo that was around $630,000. Even though flying was such a huge part of his family and clearly where they were able to be so successful, and Dylan also obviously had an interest in it at a period in his life, it ultimately came to the point where it wasn't where he saw his future. People who knew him said that he seemed to be looking for his own purpose and ended up kind of like exploring just a random array of career options. He really was all over the map. He went to training to be a chef. He studied animation. He took courses in makeup artistry as well as photography, which he was featured in a softcore you-know-what site where he had taken some photos of some gals on some of his family's planes. Nothing seemed to really be like the fit that he wanted, though. The only fit in life he seemed to be really good at was partying. And the best way I can describe Dylan to you based on what I've learned of Dylan, is one of those guys who, when you're in high school, they're older and you think they're cool because they're older and they throw parties and you like get to drink. And if you fancy doing illegal substances, you can also do that there. And then when your like late 20s hit, you realize that that person was just like such a loser and a creep. But to that crowd, his lifestyle is super impressive and by no fault of their own, because looking in on his life at my age, I find it, super impressive not knowing anything about him. Their home backed a golf course. It was beautiful. There was tons of nice, expensive cars in the driveway. They had an elevator. To me, when you think of like somebody who's made it or a house that is like, you are money, I think of an elevator. I'm like, you have an elevator in your house? Wow. Okay. And then there was like gaming consoles all throughout the home. So you could just play like a bunch of different video games in different rooms of the house. And then to top it off, another like staple that I think is like a big chef's kiss is a pool in the backyard. And they had a pool in the backyard. He also threw shindigs at Millard Air at the hangar at Toronto's Pearson Airport. So he also was throwing the bush party vibe. And people who knew him said that appeal came from not necessarily like a lot of like braggy, arrogant, like spoiled rich vibes. Like he had a charm to him. He was very generous and funded basically everything, like every outing he went on with friends, he foot the bill. There was times that he would pay for vacations for him and his friends and their girlfriends to go on. He also let his friends drive these expensive cars, live in some of his rental properties for free. And one of his friends said the best way to describe how he made people feel was that you were indestructible. It's no surprise that if your reputation is being one of the guy who throws all the parties and has the yellow Stanley toolbox that you open it up and you can find an array of illegal substances in, trying not to get demonetized here, then, you start to attract like a certain crowd. And that is how he got connected with a local drug dealer named Mark Smitch. I'm not pronouncing these names wrong. It's not like Mark Smith. It's Smitch, like with CH. And Dylan is not Dylan. It's Dellen, like Dylan. I feel like I had to explain that because like I wouldn't put it past me if I were you to mispronounce these things. Mark and Dylan were an odd duo. Mark was born August 13th, 1987. I really hate that both of them were born in my year and that like each of them are on the cusp. I'm 86, Dylan's 85, he's 87. I'm really taking it personally. Anyways, unlike Dylan's parents, Mark's were middle class and he had a little bit more of a lengthy record than Dylan. He had drug possession, driving while impaired, mischief, failure to appear, and then breach of conditions. And for a living, he sold cigarettes and illegal substances. I have to come up with a better word for that. After meeting Dylan, he occasionally took jobs at the Millard Air hangar, and this was very common, like for Dylan to hook up some of his friends who were needing some money and a job. A lot of them would go out and work there, and so Mark was one of them. But his real aspiration was to be a rapper.
Yes, it's like a freestyle session with no lesson, no question. I'm killing you in possessions, it's mine. I'm a killer, check my design. Mountains I climb and throw you off too.
So the two of them were introduced around 2006, and friends described their friendship initially as pretty one-sided. Mark was very intrigued, obviously unimpressed by Dylan and his lifestyle, maybe like a little bit of a try-hard. And Dylan wasn't really a huge fan of his. They eventually lost touch, but then a couple years later, they ran into each other, smoked a little Mary Jane, and then kind of became really tight from that moment forward. By 2012, the two of them were so close that Mark and his girlfriend had moved into the basement suite of Dylan's family home. It sounds like the arrangement wasn't really like, okay, this is your salary to help me do work around the hangar, but it was help me work. You can live here for free. Anything you need, I've got you. And that's food, drinks, shoes, whatever it is, like he footed the bill. There was also allegedly a promise to build a music studio so that Mark could record a rap album. So sad we missed that debut. Around this time, Dylan went from like having his friends help him with things around like his family business to going on these missions with him. These happened late at night, and it was theft. They do things like steal construction equipment, lawnmowers, a wood chipper that belonged to the city of Oakville. They had stolen Harley Davidson, a trailer full of Corvette rims, and even like trees, like landscaping, just stole trees. And this just started such a toxic introduction to a different world for Dylan, I think. Like, it was just so reckless. Obviously, it was for the thrill of it. He didn't need money or, these to steal these things. He had so much money. He could have bought 10 Harley Davidsons, I'm sure, or the entire home and garden section of Home Depot if he wanted trees. And in 2012, it looked like the family was even on their way to make even more money. Dylan's father had invested into expanding their company. Instead of doing repairs and stuff like that at Toronto, Pearson International, they were expanding to Waterloo, Ontario, and they were going to have like the best way that it was explained when I was researching was like a hotel for airplanes. So there really wasn't much work that was going to be done in the back end and having like all of this overhead. They were just going to be like raking in the money by people using their space. And since Wayne was in his 70s, the plan was that Dylan was going to be taught how to take over the business. So absolutely zero reason besides just selfishness and the thrill of being like a bad boy for all of this to happen. And it looked like Dylan was going to be inheriting things a lot faster than people expected, because in November 2012, Wayne was found dead in his home with a gunshot wound through his eye, and it was ruled a suicide. We will come back to Wayne, Dylan's father. Going back to Tim's disappearance, with the link from the burner phone and the description from Igor that seemed to match Dylan, police went to Millard Air Hangar to pay Dylan a visit on May 10th. The officers told him when they arrived that they were there because they were investigating the disappearance of Tim Bosma, and they asked if they could look around, and his response was, "I thought you were going to say that." Very suspicious, and even though it was suspicious, the police didn't find anything immediately incriminating, so they left, but they decided to put him under surveillance. He did some more sketchy things when he left. He headed to a bank and took out a big wad of cash. He also went and left his red truck at a friend's house. He went to an apartment building and met up with Mark Smitch. Again, nothing that's saying, okay, this is your guy. But when they pulled Dylan's phone records, they found out his cell phone was pinging off the same cell towers as the burner phone at the same time the day that Tim disappeared. Basically, looks like someone bought a burner phone to try to hide their tracks, but took the cell phone along with the burner phone to follow the tracks. With that, 4 days after Tim disappeared, police arrested Dylan and charged him with theft and forcible confinement. So at this point, Tim is still not found, and everybody is just hoping for the best. When Sherrilyn finds out that there has been an arrest, she is basically preparing for the following day to just go back to her life, because they're going to find Tim somewhere when this guy wants to get out of jail and says that he's got the truck and Tim kidnapped somewhere. Their next break came on May 12th when Tim's truck was found. It was found inside a trailer on the driveway of Dylan's mother's home. Sadly, there was no sign of Tim, and the hope that it was going to be a positive outcome was really grim. Inside, the truck had been completely stripped, and when they tested for luminol, there was a lot of signs of somebody cleaning up, a lot of blood. Naturally, it led them to believe that something horrible happened to Tim and that he was no longer alive. And 2 days later, on May 14th, those suspicions were confirmed when Tim's burned remains were found in an incinerator on Dylan's farm property. This is where the case just gets so infuriating and sickening because Tim was not targeted for anything that he did. This could have been anybody, and this was something that was long in the making, dating back to 2011. The wheels seemed to start to turn when Dylan and two of his friends had drove 500 kilometers to Mexico's Baja California Peninsula to enter the Baja 500 race. I knew nothing about this race until this case. Oh, that rhymed. I guess it was established in 1969, and it's like this world famous competition that includes like a dozen different races. So like if you have a truck, there's like a truck thing, a sedan, an ATV, motorcycles, Jeeps. And I guess that if you want to participate in it, you have to have quite a bit of money. You also need to know how to drive real well, which Dylan thought that he excelled in both. Money, yes. Skill didn't seem like it. I guess one of his friends had put $80,000 worth of modifications on Dylan's Jeep to race. But despite that and Dylan's confidence, he didn't do too well. Only 25 kilometers in an 800-kilometer race, he gutted the bottom of his Jeep on some rough terrain and the race was over. Like, you're in a Jeep. You'd figure you'd be prepared for the rough terrain aspect, says the girl who, like, is terrified of, like, going on ATVs and just, like, I will only go on the ones that are governed, so I know that they can't go too fast. Even though the numbers and position speak for itself, did not do too well, Dylan was still really confident. He even got a Desert Baja Racing logo tattoo right on his left bicep. One of his friends did too. Poor guy. And he did that because he was like, I'm doing this again. We're going to do it again, but we're going to do it different. He thought that the reason he lost and like the center of his problems had nothing to do with his lack of knowing how to maneuver the Jeep through rough terrain, but was because of the vehicle used to tow the Jeep. So this first race, they had towed the Jeep down in Dylan's red Dodge pickup, but it was gas and it was a gas guzzler. So he decided next time we're going to go and we're going to tow it down with a Dodge again, but it's got to be a diesel. This way he could cut the costs and then put more money into the Jeep modifications. Because again, $80,000 apparently wasn't enough to make him go further than 25 kilometers. We have already gone over this so many times. Dylan had money, a lot of money. If he wanted a Dodge diesel, he could have easily purchased one, but the plan was he wanted to steal it. This plan always involved his right-hand guy who was always willing to do this with him, Mark Smitch. And initially the plan just started to scope out trucks, find one, and then just go back in the middle of the night and steal it. So between early 2012 and May 2013, they were looking a lot online at different Dodge or different diesel trucks to try to find the one that they wanted to keep their eye on the road for. They were having a lot of struggles with that. Either it was one that was basically like impossible to steal, or they'd find one, but the setting was wrong. It was during the day. And then when they would go back, the truck was gone. So that's when, as time went on, they went to finding trucks online and meeting with their sellers. And this is when they bought a burner phone. Dylan was the one who purchased the phone and he registered it under the name Lucas Bate. This plan also goes further and deeper when in early 2012, Dylan asked a friend of his to build him an incinerator and also asked Mark to find a gun. When he told friends why he needed an incinerator, there was a variety of reasons. Obviously, there's no need on the surface for one at an airport hangar. So he would say that he was going to help his uncle who wanted to get in the pet cremation business. Another was that he wanted it just to be able to easily burn off garbage. And then some people, he said that he did want it to burn off like metal from the airport business. But at that time, there was really not a lot of clients and not a lot of revenue to need to do that. His friend did try to make one. It was like an epic fail though. I believe it blew up or it was close to blowing up. So he went and reached out to a professional livestock incinerator maker. He purchased one called the Eliminator. And I guess this was huge. Not something that somebody would just like, oh, I want to burn off some garbage would get. It was like 3 meters tall. It weighed over 2,700 kilograms and could cremate up to 225 kilograms of animal carcass in less than an hour. The price for that was about $15,000, but Dellen just didn't want that. He wanted modifications to this as well. He wanted this to be mobile. He wanted it on a trailer with a generator and a propane tank. So with all of the modifications, we're now at about $23,000 for this incinerator. So incinerator, check, and gun, check. Mark had reached out to one of his fellow aspiring rappers who's also known to be in the arms dealing industry. And they bought the James Bond gun. I want to say Walther PPK. So with all of this, you just see how chilling this is and that this had nothing to do with Tim at all. He was so unexpecting, undeserving, innocent victim who was working hard to provide for his family and get them out of a tight spot that they were in at that moment. Literally, if Tim had owned any gas truck, he would have never met Dellen Millard or Mark Smich. It was because Dellen wanted a diesel, allegedly to lighten the load on his next adventure to the Baja 500, and Tim had a diesel. After Dellen's arrest, investigators also were following Mark Smich. They needed more on him as well. And they're talking to people within that circle, including employees that worked at the Millard Air Hangar. And they find out that early on May 7th, Dellen had sent a text to his employees and said not to come into work that day. He said that it was air protocol. Nobody was to be at the airport, like within their department. And I guess this had never happened before. So this was May 7th. I don't think I made it clear that that was the day after Tim had died. And so on May 8th, when everybody was allowed to go back, one of the employees was the father-in-law of another employee who happened to be close to Dellen. And when he got to work, he immediately notices this black Dodge, and it's sitting on a green tarp on the floor. And he recognized it from the press conferences about Tim's disappearance. And he thought like, oh my God, is that it? And he said that he just kind of like stayed away from the truck that entire day. It was just making him sick, giving really bad vibes. And when he casually asks his son-in-law, like, what's with the truck? His son-in-law said that Dellen told him that he had just recently bought it from somebody in Kitchener. Still didn't make him feel really good. He said like his skin was crawling when he'd walk by it. So he looked in it and he sees that like it's completely stripped inside. The plates are gone. And so the next day on the 9th, he gets to work before everybody else and he takes photo of the truck's VIN number. He then calls Crime Stoppers and he asks them to check it against Tim's truck. I guess at that moment, like all of the blood drains from him, it's confirmed like this is Tim's truck. He was so sick and shocked. He ran out of the hangar and threw up. And he was just really, really struggling because his son-in-law was so close with Dellen. And he thought like, okay, what does this mean? Did my son-in-law know anything? And just between like the shock of this all, the fear of not knowing like any information, and maybe probably having like this state of shock, he just could not bring himself to tell Crime Stoppers where the truck was. He was like, I will, like, I just can't right now. That night he did ask his son-in-law about it. And I guess his son-in-law was really upset, which I guess could be understandable if you didn't want to believe that side of your friend. He just kept saying like, no, he told me that he bought this in Kitchener. He would have nothing to do with something like this. And he was so upset that he confronted Dellen about it, saying like, oh, this is what my father-in-law thinks. And so that point, Dellen knew like, okay, this is going to be only a matter of time before people start looking at me and why the truck was in a trailer on his mother's driveway. He also transported the incinerator from the hangar to his farm property. And while he was doing all of this to try to cover his tracks, he had help, but it wasn't all from Mark Smich. A lot of the time it was his girlfriend, a girl named Christina Nudga. Allegedly, she said that there was always an excuse, oh, we're moving the incinerator because it's too heavy on these boards and we're going to go put it out here and we have to move this truck. Well, she didn't know that they were moving a truck, that they're moving a trailer with stuff in it, and basically told his mother and his girlfriend, you don't need to know what's in there. Which I feel like that's just like not an excuse anymore for people, you know? He also dropped off the toolbox that all of the partygoers always used to know to go to find illegal substances. And he messaged a friend of his and said, I need to hide this toolbox. I'm feeling a little bit of heat. And the friend said like, oh, well, can you kind of prepare me for what it is? And he's like, it's a toolbox. And the friend said like full of guns. And then he just said 2. Yeah, like there's 2. So he didn't ask. He takes this toolbox. In the back of his mind, he's just like hoping he was just joking around. He knows that that's one that had like pot and other things in it. And it had a little padlock on it. So he just hid it and was like, you know, out of sight, out of mind. And all of this stuff is really crazy to think about because him having that tip allowed him to hide so much evidence that quite possibly would have allowed him to get away with murder because he did it all so fast. But the link to Tim was that tattoo, the one that said ambition in the square that Igor recognized on his test drive. And I can't imagine what that makes like Igor feel like because it seems like such like an insignificant thing to spot. It's not like he was like covered in all of these things and you notice like a couple certain tattoos. He had like 2 words that were visible on his wrist. And he said the ambition one stuck out to him because he thought in his mind, wow, ambition is very ambitious to put on your wrist and just have out there. So it stuck with him. And then in the same breath, okay, you've like helped find Tim and give answers. But then you're also thinking, wow, like I could have been Tim. And I do think that he easily could have been Tim, except for his test drive was a little bit different. Tim is described as, you know, like friendly and not very like overpowering. He was tall. He was like 6 feet tall, but he was only like 170 pounds. And Igor is described as over 6 feet and built like concrete. He had a military background, and he said during the test drive, Dylan was asking things about like the truck's layout and the suspension and the engine, and Igor was able to give him very good answers. And he said, you know, I'm familiar with engines because of my time in the Israeli army. And he said at this point, Mark, who was like known to him as like the more quiet guy who hadn't said anything, asked him what he did in the army. And his response was just like very direct, very gruff. And he said, you don't want to know what I did there. And he said at that point, just like the dynamic of the car had shifted. And it was very quick after that the test drive ended. It took about a week of surveillance for police to gather enough evidence behind the scenes to arrest Mark Smich, and he was arrested on his BMX bike with his girlfriend on the morning of May 22nd. One of the main things that police wanted from Mark was to locate the gun because that would just further strengthen their case. They knew the one was purchased, and after Dylan's arrest, Mark had tried to dispose of this gun. He wouldn't give investigators anything except for that he had buried it, and he didn't remember where he had buried it because he had been riding for so long that he didn't know which direction he was in or what landmarks were around. At the end of the day, there was already so much evidence, a lot of it leading to this burner phone that really did nothing because their phones were pretty much tied to it the entire time. Plus having all of the other evidence like the incinerator with Tim's remains, his truck found on his mom's property, that incinerator found on his land. It was pretty strong evidence even though they were pleading not guilty. And during trial, there were 3 different versions. Dylan pointed everything to Mark. He said that they were just early in their test drive when he looked behind him and he saw that he was pointing this Walther PPK handgun at the back of Tim's head from the back seat. And he said that was never part of the plan. All of a sudden, Mark speaks up and says, "We're going to take the truck." Dylan says Tim tries to grab the gun from Mark and they are in this wrestle for the power. And all of a sudden, this shot goes out and it struck Tim and it blew out the passenger side window. Dylan says he pulls over and he gets out furious with Mark and he's like, "Why would you bring a gun?" He said, "We need to call an ambulance. Like, look what you've done." And Mark said, "There's no point. He's already dead. We're going to get in trouble." So they drive to a field that's nearby Tim's house that they had actually left Dylan's SUV at. Surprise, surprise, there's no other friend. And since Dylan was terrified of being pinned for the murder, they agreed to burn all of the evidence. Mark's version is the night went mostly to plan. They're doing their test drive. It's just a short distance from Tim's house. And then Mark says Dylan pulls out his phone and says that he got a text from their friend who was allegedly at the Tim Hortons. And Mark said him having this fake text was never really part of the plan. The plan was they were going to go on this test drive and then go back to the property after and then steal the truck. So now this text was going rogue. And then Dylan pulls over to the shoulder of the road. Just past the entrance of where they had parked, this is where Dylan's SUV was. And so he looks at Mark and says, "Why don't you go hop in the SUV and meet our friend?" So he's confused. Mark says that he just takes the hint, jumps out, goes into the SUV, and inside the console, the keys are there. And so he decides to follow Dylan. They're driving a short distance, and then all of a sudden he says that the truck just starts swerving and then stops. Mark pulls over, he sees Dylan get out, and as he's getting out, he stuffs a gun in the back of his satchel. Mark said he thought, what is going on? He said he got out, he crept towards the passenger side, and that's where he saw Tim face down on the dashboard covered in blood. Then it's him all of a sudden, what the F is going on? And Dylan's livid. He's like, "Don't worry." He tells him to swap the plates, and he's so scared for his life, he just does what he's told. He says when they get to the incinerator and Dylan asks him to help put Tim's body in it, he says he can't. He's just sick, but he doesn't want him to know that, so he says that he's got a shoulder injury. He says he goes to lock up the gate, and when he comes back, Tim's body is nowhere to be found. The two then drive to Millard Air Hangar, and he says at this point he did help strip the truck, but that's as far as it went. The Crown's theory is kind of a variation of both, except for obviously they both were aware. They probably only drove a short distance with Tim, arrived at that field that the SUV was parked at. They shot Tim, and Mark got out, drove the SUV, followed Dylan, who was driving the truck, and they start disposing of all of the evidence that evening and next day. They are ultimately convicted of the murder of Tim Bosma, and Dylan's girlfriend Christina was also charged with being an accessory. And after Dylan's conviction in the death of Tim, it came out that Tim might have not been the only person to have died at the hands of Dylan Millard and Mark Smidge. Dylan's ex-girlfriend, 23-year-old Laura Babcock, was killed on or around July 3rd, 2012, just 10 months before Tim. She had gone missing, and the good thing about Laura's, well, not good, but the positive into solving what happened to Laura is that she also had another ex-boyfriend who she was still very close with, who he seemed to still love her a lot. And so he had access to her phone records. I believe he was paying for her cell phone. And he immediately noticed that the last call was to Dylan Millard from Laura's phone. Even though he had this and he brought it to police, her disappearance was initially just brushed aside. At the time in Laura's life, this was a very brief time. Not that that matters anyways, but we'll just say it. Police kind of brush it off because she was in a high-risk lifestyle. She was an escort at the time, or believed to be working as an escort, and had gone to the hospital to talk about depression. Therefore, like we know, in so many cases equals apparently not worth searching for. I literally don't understand why this always seems to be an excuse to not look for somebody. Everybody deserves to be searched for and looked for and cared about. And Laura, especially, she's described as just this whimsical little thing, almost like juvenile, with her happiness and bubbly personality and just loving spirit. She dreamed of being an actress, but unfortunately never got the chance when she met Dylan in a bar one evening. I guess it was a very short period that they dated, only like a month or less, but they remained friends. People said she spent a lot of time around Dylan and his place and almost kind of looked like she was just like drawn into that lifestyle that he flaunted. It wasn't really something that she was used to. And during their friendship, Laura had moved on. She got a boyfriend, but still remained close with Dylan. And her boyfriend actually threw her 23rd birthday and invited Dylan. And he also invited Christina. So they started dating after that. But allegedly, Christina was just really jealous of Laura. The two of them also had this like text exchange that didn't go so well. Christina had sent her a happy birthday message saying, "Happy birthday. A year ago today, I slept with Dylan for the first time." And Laura replied, "That's fine. I slept with him a few days ago." So this did not go well. And Christina made that very clear. And Dylan on text said that he was going to get her out of their lives. This, unfortunately, was only found out after the connection of Dylan with Tim Bosma. And then at that point, her phone records were taken seriously. When they started investigating everything, again, it was technology that led to like the smoking gun. The text between Dylan and Christina said, "First, I'm going to hurt her." This coming from Dylan to Christina about Laura. And he said, "Then I'm going to let her leave. And then I will remove her from our lives." He then texted friends to have them update him on if they would see her out and about, just to kind of keep tabs on her. And no one can really say what happened, but when we were talking about that purchase of the Eliminator, this was months before Tim even disappeared. But it was placed only days before Laura went missing. Based on phone records, we know that on July 3rd, Laura and Dylan's phones were both pinging together. They both started pinging at the same time at a subway station in Toronto, and then both traveled to Dylan's home. The next day, both phones went along Lake Ontario, and then Laura's stopped pinging. Dylan's continued to his farm, and then his camera was used to take a photo, and this photo was a blue tarp that looked like it was in the shape of a body, with a body inside of it. Now, it's believed Laura's body was in the barn on Dylan's property for a couple weeks because he was needing to wait for this incinerator and all of the modifications to be built. Once he received it that day, there was a series of photos of Mark Smitch with a big smile holding like the incinerator pitchfork, and then a video where you can see it's late at night, but you can see sparks and burning, and that's believed to be Laura's body burning. Dylan's recent Google searches didn't really help eliminate him as a suspect by any mean. It was, what temperature is cremation done at? And then that same day, Mark wrote rap lyrics on Laura's iPad that he renamed Mark's iPad, and it was a new rap song of his. I'm not a rapper, but these were some of the lyrics. "That bee started off all skin and bone. Now the bee lay on some ashy stone. Last time I saw hers outside the home. And if you go swimming, you can find her phone."
The started off all skin and bone. Now the lay on some ashy stone. Last time I saw her outside the home. And if you go swimming, you can find the phone. Find the phone? What? Find the phone. If you go swimming, you can find the phone. Find the phone. Find the phone.
Again, super disappointed that I didn't wait in line for a debut album. The two of them were also both charged in the murder of Laura Babcock. And then remember Dylan's father, whose death was ruled a suicide just like less than a year before Tim's death. Dylan went on trial for his murder on May 31st, 2018. So the prosecutors felt that after everything, and now that they were able to look again at the scene and take like a closer look, it seemed like it was physically impossible for Wayne to have taken his own life, and that means that it wasn't a suicide. It was also discovered that Dylan lied about his alibi that night. Also, the gun that was found at that scene was a Smith & Wesson that he had bought a day before Laura went missing. Now, the day that Dylan found his father, he said he found him in his bed and he was dead. But he said he had no idea what happened because he had just been at the hangar all day, and then the night prior he had stayed at Mark Smitch's house. He said he came home from work, he found his dad, he called his mom because he was in shock, and then it was his mom who came over, saw his dad, and then called 911. When EMS arrived, they did see that Wayne was shot in the eye, and they made note that that was a little bit concerning because this was not a common area to, end your life, especially if you're choosing like the cranial area. And the coroner had stated that there was no gunshot residue on Wayne's hand, but he did believe that it was a suicide and noted that Wayne had died because of a bullet to the brain. So I guess unless knowing by physically being at the scene and you're just looking at a report, there was no investigation, which means there was no trace on where this gun came from. There was DNA taken from the handle of the gun, but it was never tested, and the case was just closed. After Tim's murder, those swaps were tested, and they did come back positive for Dylan's DNA, and they were able to find out that he really didn't have an alibi, even though he said that he was with Mark, and Mark said yes. Mark was actually with his girlfriend, and she did say that earlier on in that afternoon, all of them were together, but Dylan said that he had to leave because he was going on a mysterious date, and she didn't see him until around 6 o'clock the next morning, and he had snuck into the house. So I believe that he was probably hoping to just sneak in while she was asleep and act like he had gotten in there in the middle of the night and was there all night, but she was able to say that he was not there that evening. I've heard a couple versions of the motive, one being that Dylan believed that his dad was making very poor investment decisions, that they weren't really taking off, and he felt like he was just kind of blowing his inheritance. And then I've also heard versions of Wayne feeling like it was Dylan that was being reckless with his money, spending it very, very frivolously, and was in the process of cutting him off. It was a judge that ruled on this case and ultimately found Dylan Millard guilty of first-degree murder in Wayne Millard's death. Recently, Dylan is trying to appeal all of these convictions. He's basically saying that he's just a scapegoat for Mark's poor decisions, and why would he be so stupid to have technology bust him? And it is a good question, Dylan. Why would you? Poor decisions, but very glad they happened. Just to go to show how arrogant he is and how he just believes that he's truly above everybody, which is why I think all of this happened. Just his own ego and there's not even a word, just deplorable human being who just thinks he's above everybody. He's self-representing himself with his appeals. So good luck on that. Anyways, that's where things stand today. And none of these people deserve to lose their lives, especially when the world was at this kid's fingertips. He could have done anything with his life. He could have afforded 10 of Tim's trucks. And for him to do what he did is just, it's made me sick this whole time I've been researching. So I hope they never, ever see the light of day. And I'm sending so much love to Wayne's remaining family members, aside from fucking Dylan, and Laura's friends and family, and Tim's friends and family. Okay, that is it for me today. If you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It means the world to me. I love and I appreciate you so much. Oh, I wanted to, before I give the riddle also, I wanted to give a huge thank you to everybody who supported and has been sending love to our dear friends who are going through a very tragic loss right now. If you missed last week's video, our very close family friends who is like an uncle to me just unexpectedly lost their 12-year-old daughter, and it's just been really gut-wrenching to see and process and know how much pain they're going through. They currently have a GoFundMe set up right now, hoping to come home to Canada from the Philippines where they currently are right now. It's quite a big expense, and they don't have a lot of money out there. So right now, as of today, which I'm filming on a Thursday, they are just about halfway to their goal. So if you would like to send some love and support, which is really, I think, the only thing that is getting them through these days, I will have the link to that GoFundMe. And thank you everybody who already has done so and has said, you know, that you're a Sippendale. They know what that means and they're so thankful. So thank you. Okay, the answer to today's riddle. Once again, the reminder is, what kind of room has no windows or doors? And the answer, you guys, it's so cute. It's a mushroom. A mushroom, right? Okay. Okay, guys, I love you. I will see you in the next video. I miss you terribly. Until then, make sure to love each other, love yourself, and I will see you soon. Bye.